There is a key in my hand. A small, ordinary key. The kind that opens a bedroom door. The kind you wouldn't think twice about if someone handed it to you. She handed it to me on a Tuesday morning. 9:47 a.m. I remember because I had just been discharged from the hospital and my wristband was still on. I hadn't even taken off my coat. I remember because I was thinking about my children. About how much I had missed them in those 18 hours. About whether my daughter had eaten. About whether my son had cried himself to sleep without me. I remember because when I took that key from her hand, I felt something. Something cold. Something that had no name yet. She looked at me and said, "They were disturbing me." That was all. My name is Vivian. And what I found when I opened that door, what the next 72 hours put me through, changed everything I understood about love, sacrifice, and the people we invite into our homes. Stay with me. Because this story starts long before that Tuesday morning. It starts with a house I sold for a dream. And a husband who turned that dream into the worst days of my life. But it does not end the way you think it will. That is the part one need you to hear. My mother always said, "Vivian, you love too completely. And one day, someone will use that against you." I never believed her. I thought loving completely was a virtue, not a vulnerability. Let me tell you who I was before all of this. I grew up in Kumasi. Middle-class family in a quiet neighborhood of the Ashanti Road. My father was a civil engineer who worked himself into an early grave before I turned 19. What he left behind was a modest house, 3 bedrooms, a veranda that caught the evening breeze, and a mango tree in the compound that I used to climb barefoot when I was 7. The neighbors always knew where to find me. That house was not just a property. That house was my father. I met Kenny in 2014. I was 26. He was 31. He walked into the NGO where I was volunteering, coordinating a literacy program for out-of-school children in the Ashanti region, wearing a blue trim shirt that was slightly too big for him, and he had this way of listening. Not just hearing you. Actually listening. Like your words mattered more than whatever was happening in his own head. I fell in love with that version of Kenny. The one who listened. We married in 2016. A small ceremony in Kumasi. My sister Alison, everyone called her ally, was my maid of honor. She wore gold kent. She cried 3 times. Once at the vows, once when our mother Margaret made her toast, and once, she told me later, when she saw the way Kenny looked at me across the room. He looked at you like you were something he was afraid to lose, she told me. I thought that was beautiful. We had our first child, our son, Nathan, in 2017. A wild, laughing boy who came into the world at 3:22 a.m. on a Saturday and immediately grabbed my finger and refused to let go. He smelled like warm bread and something sweeter underneath. The midwife said he was the calmest newborn she had seen in years. And then, in 2019, we started talking about the future. Kenny had a cousin in Canada who kept talking about life abroad. Stability. Better schools. Healthcare. Opportunities that didn't require you to know someone who knew someone. Kenny would come home from those conversations glowing with a restless energy, half excitement, half desperation, and he would sit at our kitchen table with his hands folded and say, "Viv, I want more for Nathan. I want more for us." And I wanted it too. I did. But the money was the problem. Visa applications. Immigration lawyers. The cost of starting over in a country that doesn't know your name. I sold my father's house. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I saw the house my father built. The house with the veranda that caught the evening breeze. The house with the mango tree in the compound. I sold it, every cedi of the proceeds going into our relocation fund, because I believed in us. Because Kenny said us and I had a promise. My mother Margaret called me the night the sale closed. She was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said, "Vivian, that money is not just money. It is your father's blood. Be careful who you pour it on." I told her she was being dramatic. We relocated to Canada in late 2020. Ontario. A rented 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like fresh paint and someone else's life. Nathan was 3 years old and thought the snow was magic. He kept pressing his face against the window every morning like it might have changed overnight. We were starting over. We were happy. And that happiness, I want you to remember it. Because it is the thing that made everything that came after so much harder to survive. There is a thing about joy that nobody tells you. When you are inside it, you stop looking around. You stop noticing things at the edges of the frame. You stop asking questions. Looking back now, I should have noticed the way Kenny's phone always turned face down when his mother called. But I didn't. I was too busy building what I thought was our future. I found out I was pregnant again in March of 2022. 8 weeks. A girl, we would later learn. We named her Sophie before she was even born. Because that is who she already felt like. Something bright. Something that fills a room before it even enters it. But even in those first glowing weeks of the pregnancy, there were things I was filing away without knowing I was filing them. The first sign was in April. Kenny started working later. Not consistently, inconsistently. Some weeks he was home by 6. Other weeks, midnight. And when I asked what was keeping him, the answer changed every time. A project. A meeting. The guys from the office. The reasons shifted like sand, and each time I tried to put my foot down on one, it wasn't there anymore. I told myself he was stressed. He had been talking about a promotion. I told myself this was what ambition looked like from the inside. I was wrong. The second sign was his phone. He had never been precious about his phone before. In our early years he would leave it on the bathroom counter, on the kitchen table, next to my pillow. I never went through it, not because I didn't have access, but because I had no reason to want to. But somewhere in May, the phone became an extension of his palm. He slept with it face down on the nightstand. He took it to the bathroom. When it buzzed during dinner, he would glance at the screen and flip it over in one smooth, practiced motion, like someone who had trained himself not to react. I noticed. I rationalized. Men in their 30s become more private, I told myself. He is probably planning a surprise. He is probably dealing with something at work he doesn't want to bring home. I was wrong again. The third sign came from Ally. My sister called me on a Sunday evening in June. I was standing at the kitchen counter eating kenki from a bowl, the frozen kind, not the real kind. That is what immigration does to you, and she said, "Viv, I spoke to Kenny's cousin Kwame last week." I said, "Okay." She said, "He mentioned that your mother-in-law Ruth has been asking about you. About the pregnancy. Specifically asking whether you had sorted out who was coming to help when the baby comes." I said, "That is thoughtful of her." Ally was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Viv. She wasn't asking thoughtfully. Kwame said she was asking like she was checking. Like she already knew the answer and wanted to confirm it matched hers." I told Alice she was reading too much into a second-hand conversation. She said, just speak to Kenny directly. About who is coming? It is Mommy Margaret, right? And I said, of course it is. Who else would it be? That question, who else would it be, I have replayed so many times since then. I replayed the confidence in my own voice. The casual certainty. The way I didn't even feel I needed to verify it with Kenny because it was so obviously what we had agreed on. We had talked about it. My mother was retired. She loved Nathan with an intensity that made my chest tight with gratitude. She had been counting down to this second grandchild since I told her I was pregnant. She had already bought Ken's fabric in pink and cream. She was ready. We had talked about it. But had Kenny agreed? The fourth sign was August. I was 7 months pregnant. Uncomfortable in ways that are hard to describe to anyone who hasn't carried a child in a Canadian winter. My back ached constantly. Nathan was 4.5 and had discovered the word why and applied it to absolutely everything in existence. I needed Kenny present. I needed him here. But Kenny, in August, was distracted in a way I hadn't seen before. Not distracted by his phone. Not distracted by work. Distracted by something internal. Like he was having a conversation in his head he wasn't ready to bring into the room. I asked him once, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm fine, Viv. Just tired." I looked at him for a moment. Something in me wanted to push. To say, "No. Tell me what is actually happening." But I was tired too. And I had learned somewhere along the way that sometimes you don't push the door because you're not ready for what's behind it. The fifth sign was a receipt. September. I was doing laundry, because even abroad, in a 2-bedroom apartment, the domestic labor somehow still belonged to the pregnant woman, and I found a receipt in the pocket of Kenny's grey jacket. A travel agency receipt. 1 international flight booking. Accra to Toronto. Return open-ended. I stood in that laundry room for a long moment. The dryer was running. It smelled like warm cotton and something synthetic underneath. My heart was doing something strange and irregular in my chest. One name on the booking. Ruth Mensah. My mother-in-law Ruth. Not Margaret Edu. Not my mother. I walked back to the living room with the receipt in my hand. Kenny was sitting on the couch. He looked up at me, and something moved across his face, so fast I almost missed it. Not guilt exactly. Something more like resignation. Like a man who had been waiting for a specific moment and was now simply watching it arrive. "What is this?" I asked. He took a breath. Then he said, "Viv. My mother wants to be here for the birth. She is getting older." She asked me. I couldn't say no to her. "What about my mother?" I said. "Your mother can come later," he said. "After. When things settle down." I want you to understand what I felt in that moment. Not just anger. Not just betrayal. Something quieter and more devastating. The feeling of realizing that in a decision about my body, my delivery, my recovery, I had not been consulted. I had been informed. After the fact. With a receipt from a jacket pocket. I said, "Kenny. We agreed. We agreed it would be my mother." He said, "I know. But things changed. My mother needs this, Viv." "And what do I need?" I asked. He didn't answer. "I want to tell you about the conversation I almost had." 3 weeks before my due date, I was on a video call with my mother, Margaret. She was wearing her reading glasses, the ones with the thin gold frame that she has had since 2008 and refuses to replace, and she was telling me about the fabric she had bought for Sophie. Pink and cream Kent. She was going to have something sewn by hand, she said. Something special for the baby's first photographs. I have been practicing my Kellaway recipe too, she said, laughing softly. Nathan loves my Kellaway. I want to make it for him the week I arrive so he knows his grandmother is really there. I opened my mouth. I had prepared what I was going to say. I had rehearsed it for 3 days. Mommy, there has been a change in the plan. Kenny has booked his mother first. But I am going to fix it. I am going to call the travel agency. I am going to speak to Kenny tonight. I want you here. Not my mother-in-law Ruth. You. Just give me a few days. I had the words. They were right there. And then she smiled at me through the screen. That particular smile. The one she has been giving me since I was 7 years old and had scraped my knee climbing the mango tree and was trying very hard not to cry. The one that says I see you, and you are going to be okay. And I thought, if I tell her now, she will worry. She will not sleep. She will pray herself into exhaustion. She will blame herself for not pushing harder when I sold the house. So I said nothing. I said, I can't wait to see you, Mommy. She said, me too, my daughter. Me too. I was so close. If I had just told her, if I had just said the words out loud, she would have been on that plane instead of my mother-in-law Ruth. She would have been in that apartment. She would have been the one holding Sophie at 2 a.m. She would have been the one who helped. But I didn't. I kept the peace. And the peace cost me more than I can ever fully explain. The second almost discovery happened 10 days before my due date. Kenny was in the shower. His phone was on the nightstand. It lit up with a message. I wasn't snooping, I was walking past to get a glass of water and the screen caught my eye. The preview visible on the lock screen. The name, Mama. And the message. My son. Remember what we said. This is our chance. She listens to you. Use it. I stood over the phone. My hand was hovering. Our chance. Use it. Use it for what? The shower turned off. I stepped back. I put my water glass down. By the time Kenny came out with a towel around his waist, I was sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, telling myself, it is just a mother talking to her son. You are hormonal. You are reading darkness into ordinary words. I was so close. If I had just picked up that phone. If I had just scrolled up and read the full conversation. If I had just asked him plainly, Kenny. What did your mother mean by that? I was so close. But I had spent 8 years learning how to keep the peace. And old habits, especially the ones wrapped in love, are the hardest ones to break. Sophie was born on a Thursday. 6:14 a.m. The labor was 14 hours. She came out screaming, not like distress, like announcement. Like she had something to say from the very first breath. The nurse laid her on my chest and I felt something I cannot name. Something that has no word in English or Twi. She had a full head of dark hair and her father's ears and she smelled like everything that has ever been good in my life, compressed into one small, miraculous human being. My mother-in-law Ruth was in the waiting room when they took me to recovery. She came in to see the baby. She looked at Sophie in my arms and said, she looks like outside. Not beautiful. Not congratulations. Not well done, my daughter. Just, she looks like outside. I should have heard what was underneath those words. We came home 2 days later. My mother-in-law Ruth was in the spare room. She had unpacked completely, her clothes folded on the chair, her Bible on the nightstand, her slippers arranged by the door. She had made herself at home in a way that felt less like a guest and more like an occupation. The first night, Sophie cried from 1 a.m. to almost 4. My stitches were fresh. Moving was slow and painful. I was nursing and my body was in open rebellion. I needed help. I knocked on my mother-in-law Ruth's door at 1:30 a.m. She opened it. She looked at me, at the baby in my arms, at my face, at my state, and she said, "My body doesn't take stress. You know I have high blood pressure." Then she closed the door. I stood in the hallway with Sophie against my shoulder and I thought, she is old. She is tired. Tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow was not different. On day 5, Sophie developed a fever. 38.7 degrees. I had Nathan needing breakfast and a screaming newborn and a body that had not slept more than 2 consecutive hours. I walked to my mother-in-law Ruth's room and knocked. She opened it. I said, "Mommy, the baby has a fever. Please, I just need you to watch Nathan for an hour." My mother-in-law Ruth said, "Where is my son? This is his house. Why are you asking me?" I said, "Kenny is at work, Mommy." She said, "Then call him." And she went back into the room and turned on the television. I stood outside that closed door and something in me fractured quietly. But I had no energy for a war. I had no energy for anything except surviving the next hour. On day 7, Kenny came home and my mother-in-law Ruth had cooked for him. Light soup. His favorite. The apartment smelled like smoked fish and palm base and something that felt like belonging to him, not to me. She set a plate in front of him. She sat across from him at the table. She did not look in my direction once. And Kenny said, "Mama, this is incredible. You always know what I need." I was standing at the counter holding a baby who had not stopped crying for 3 days. I had not eaten a hot meal since I came home from the hospital. I looked at him and I thought, I sold my father's house for this. On day 9, I called Ali from the bathroom floor with the tap running so my mother-in-law Ruth wouldn't hear me. I told her everything. Ali said, "Viv, this woman is not there to help you. She is there to make a point." I told her she was being dramatic. She said, "Vivian, get Mommy on a plane. Today. I will pay for the ticket myself." I said, "It will cause a fight. Kenny will feel like I am disrespecting his mother." She said, "Good. Let him feel that." I didn't book the ticket. And 2 days later, day 11, my own fever started. By 9 p.m. my temperature was 39.4. Kenny looked at me with real alarm and said, "We need to go to the hospital." I said, "The children?" He said, "My mother will watch them." I looked at my mother-in-law Ruth across the room. She was sitting in her armchair with that same flat, composed expression she had worn since the day she arrived. Everything in me wanted to say no. But I was shaking and my thoughts were sleeping and Kenny's hand was already on my arm. I said to my mother-in-law Ruth, "Mommy. Please. The children." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. Kenny took me to the hospital. And I left my children with my mother-in-law Ruth. I was kept overnight. Postpartum infection. I called the apartment every few hours. My mother-in-law Ruth picked up the first 2 times. She said the children were fine. The 3rd time, nobody picked up. Kenny told me the phone was on the charger. That his mother was with the children. That I should rest. I tried to rest. They discharged me at 8 a.m. on Tuesday. We drove home. We went upstairs. Kenny knocked on his mother's door. My mother-in-law Ruth came out in her housecoat. Her face was composed. Not tired. Not worried. Just composed. I said, "Mommy, where are the children?" My mother-in-law Ruth opened her hand. A key. She placed it in my palm and said, "They were disturbing me." I looked at the key. I looked at her face. I walked to the children's room. The door opened. Nathan was on the floor beside the bed. He had slid off at some point in the night and didn't have the strength to climb back up. Sophie was on the mattress. Her small chest was rising and falling in a way that was too slow. Too shallow. The heating vent in the room had been closed. The room was cold. There was no water. No food. Nothing. They were alive. But they were barely there. I screamed for Kenny. And I don't remember the next few minutes in any ordered way. I remember the sound of my own voice, a sound I didn't recognize as mine. I remember Kenny in the doorway. I remember pressing Sophie to my chest. I remember touching Nathan's face and saying his name over and over. I remember calling the emergency services. I remember the operator's voice telling me to stay calm. I could not stay calm. The ambulance came in 7 minutes. 7 minutes that felt like 7 years. The paramedics worked fast and spoke in that controlled, urgent language that medical people use when the situation is serious and they are trying not to show you how serious. They took both children. Nathan on a stretcher. Sophie wrapped in a thermal blanket that looked enormous against her 11-day-old body. I rode in that ambulance and I held Nathan's hand the entire way and I did not take my eyes off the monitor tracking Sophie's heartbeat. That small, stubborn, irreplaceable heartbeat. The hospital took them both directly to the ICU. And I stood outside the unit, in my hospital discharge clothes, with my wristband still on, with the key that my mother-in-law Ruth had handed me still in the pocket of my coat, and I waited. And while I waited, the police arrived at my apartment. Because the paramedic who came through that bedroom door, the one who had seen the closed vent and the absence of water and the locked door, had already made a call. And my mother-in-law Ruth was still in that apartment. What happened in that ICU over the next 72 hours? What the police found in that apartment? What was on my mother-in-law Ruth's phone? What Ali had been doing quietly without telling me? What Kenny knew and when he knew it? And what happened in that courtroom 8 months later? That is part 2. But I need you to understand something before you go. My children were in that ICU because I kept the peace. Because I called a woman mommy who did not deserve the tenderness in that word. Because I chose comfort, his comfort, her comfort, everyone's comfort except my own, over and over and over again. And when you come back for part 2, because I need you to come back, you are going to find out that the woman who handed me that key thought the story ended with me standing in that hallway. She was wrong. It was just beginning. Because what happens next, what Ali had been doing behind the scenes, what was found on that phone, what the judge said on that Wednesday afternoon, you will not see any of it coming. Not a single part of it. And if you are new here, if someone sent you this video or the algorithm brought you, welcome. This channel is where African women's stories get told the way they actually happened. With all the love and all the betrayal and all the survival that nobody talks about but everyone needs to hear. Hit subscribe. Turn on your notifications. Because there are more stories coming. And they are all true. And they are all ours. I am Vivian. Go watch part 2. I will be right there waiting for you.